Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a pretty interesting situation developing with Nvidia and China. I've got this stack of articles here all about how China is investigating Nvidia for potential antitrust violations. And, this isn't just about some legal technicalities. This is getting tangled up in the whole U.S.-China tech war.
You hit the nail on the head. We're talking about control of the semiconductor industry, the future of AI.
It's a big deal. So let's break it down. Where do we even start with this?
Yeah.
I guess the beginning is back in 2019 when Nvidia bought Mellanox Technologies, right?
Right. And China approved that deal. But, they attached some conditions. They wanted to make sure NVIDIA would keep supplying their products to Chinese companies on fair terms.
Okay, and now China's saying Nvidia's broken that agreement.
That's their claim. They're saying NVIDIA stopped supplying certain products, which could be a violation. But, and here's where it gets tricky, NVIDIA is pushing back, saying, hey, it's not us. It's the U.S. export controls on those advanced chips. We're caught in the middle.
So it's Nvidia's word against China's. But is China really just concerned about fair play here?
Well, some experts think there's a bigger game afoot. They believe this investigation is more about China pushing back against the U.S., trying to become less reliant on American tech.
Trying to level the playing field, maybe even tip it in their favor.
Exactly. And they want to boost their own domestic chip industry. They don't want to depend on companies like Nvidia anymore. They want to build their own.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Every move has huge consequences. And what about the penalties Nvidia's facing? They're pretty serious, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking potential fines of up to 10% of their annual revenue.
That's billions of dollars.
Billions with a B. That kind of hit could really hurt their R&D budget. Imagine the innovation they could be funding if they weren't staring down the barrel of those fines. And that gives an advantage to competitors like Intel who aren't facing the same pressures.
It's like a double whammy. So, knowing all this, you'd think Nvidia would be backing away from China, trying to avoid more trouble. But they're actually doing the opposite.
Doubling down.
They're developing a special AI chip specifically for the Chinese market. That seems risky.
It is a bold move, but the Chinese market is huge. It makes up about 16% of NVIDIA's revenue. Walking away would be a huge blow.
I can see why they wouldn't want to do that.
But yeah, they're walking a tightrope. They need to keep the Chinese government happy while also trying to keep up with their global ambitions.
So they're trying to appease both sides, which is, easier said than done. But will this China-specific chip actually work? Will it be enough to smooth things over?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Designing a chip just for one market, that presents all sorts of technical challenges. And even if they pull it off, there's no guarantee it'll satisfy the Chinese government. They might just see it as a temporary solution while they keep working on their own domestic alternatives.
It's like they're buying themselves some time, hoping they can figure things out before the clock runs out. And Nvidia isn't the only company in this position, are they? Other American tech giants like Intel and Micron, they're facing similar scrutiny in China.
Absolutely. This whole situation with NVIDIA, it's like a warning sign for any tech company operating in this increasingly political landscape. If things go badly for NVIDIA, it could embolden Chinese regulators to go after other companies, too. It's a domino effect.
And the implications go far beyond just individual companies. This could impact the whole global tech ecosystem.
Exactly. Right now, we tend to think of the tech world as this interconnected space. But what if things start to fracture? What if the U.S. and China end up creating their own separate spheres of influence?
That's a scary thought. What would that even look like? What would it mean for the future of technology?
Well, that's a question we'll have to grapple with. But first, let's dig deeper into what all this means for NVIDIA specifically.
Nvidia is kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, trying to keep both the U.S. and China happy.
It's a tough spot to be in, that's for sure. And the consequences for NVIDIA, they could be pretty far-reaching.
So let's get into that. If things go really badly for Nvidia, what are the worst-case scenarios here?
Well, like we talked about before, that 10% fine on their annual revenue, that would be a massive blow. We're talking billions of dollars, money they could be using to invest in new technology, stay ahead of the game in AI. And you know what? It's not just about the money itself. It's about the impact it could have on their future.
Right. So like if you suddenly had to run a marathon with like a 50-pound weight strapped to your back.
Exactly. It's going to slow you down, make it harder to compete. And then there's the whole issue of reputation. If they're found guilty of violating China's antitrust laws, that's a big hit to their credibility.
Yeah, especially in a market as big as China.
Think about it. Chinese consumers might start thinking twice about buying NVIDIA products. Chinese companies might hesitate to partner with them. It's a trust issue on a massive scale.
So they lose money, they lose trust, they lose momentum. What else could go wrong?
Well, China could really make things difficult for them, restrict how they do business there, limit their expansion, their investments, their growth potential, essentially put them in a technological timeout.
So on top of everything else, their ability to grow in one of the world's biggest tech markets gets choked off. And I guess we can't forget about that Mellanox acquisition that's looming large in all of this, right?
Oh, absolutely. That deal is under a microscope right now. Chinese regulators are scrutinizing every detail, convinced that Nvidia might have used it to gain an unfair advantage in the market.
And what if they decide Nvidia did use it unfairly?
Well, they could force Nvidia to sell off parts of their business, to break up that advantage. So, yeah, a lot of things could go wrong here for Nvidia.
It's a pretty bleak picture. But let's flip the script for a minute. What would a win look like for Nvidia in this situation? What's the best case scenario?
The ideal outcome. The investigation concludes, and they find no wrongdoing. Nvidia is completely cleared of all charges. They can just go back to business as usual. That's the dream.
That's got to be what they're hoping for. No fines, no restrictions, no damage to their reputation.
Exactly. They can keep building those relationships in China, maintain their position as a leader in the AI market, and avoid all that potential chaos we talked about earlier.
Okay, so they dodged the bullet, but what about those U.S. export restrictions? Those are still in place, right? Even if China gives them the all clear, they're still bound by those U.S. rules.
You're right, that's the elephant in the room. Those export controls are a constant factor, a reminder that the U.S.-China tech war isn't going away anytime soon. Even if they navigate this investigation successfully, they're still going to have to walk that tightrope, balancing the demands of both countries.
It's like they're playing a game with two different sets of rules.
Yeah, and the stakes are incredibly high.
So we've got the best case, the worst case, but realistically, it's probably going to fall somewhere in between,
Yeah,
right?
a settlement is a pretty common outcome in these kinds of antitrust cases. Nvidia might agree to pay a smaller fine, make some concessions to appease the Chinese regulators, avoid a long, drawn-out legal battle.
So a compromise, kind of like a plea deal in a criminal case.
Yeah.
But even with a settlement, wouldn't there still be consequences for Nvidia?
Oh, there's always a price to pay. Any admission of guilt, any agreement to a fine, even a reduced one, that's still going to spook some investors, potentially hurt their reputation. It's a tough call, weighing those costs and benefits.
It's a lose-lose situation in some ways. No matter what they do, there's going to be some damage. And it really highlights how complicated things have become for tech companies.
The days of just focusing on building great products, those days are over. Now they have to be global strategists, political analysts, almost like diplomats. It's a whole new game.
And this whole situation with Nvidia, it's like a microcosm of that bigger trend. It's not just about one company. It's about the future of the entire tech industry.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll zoom out and look at those broader implications, what other tech companies can learn from all of this, what it means for the future of global tech, and how all of this might affect us as consumers.
And you know what? After going through all of this, it's clear this isn't just a legal issue, right? This feels like a sign of something much bigger happening in the tech world.
You're absolutely right. This situation with Nvidia, it's like a canary in the coal mine for other tech companies. The world is changing, and they need to adapt or risk getting caught in the crossfire.
So let's talk about that. What are the big takeaways here? What can other tech companies learn from watching this whole thing unfold?
The biggest lesson: geopolitics matters. It's not enough to just build the best product anymore. Companies need to understand the political landscape, the risks, the potential pitfalls of operating in different countries.
So it's not just about innovation. It's about being politically savvy.
Exactly. They need to build relationships with governments, anticipate changes in the political winds, and be flexible enough to adjust their strategies.
Flexibility is key. And what about the role of governments in all of this? What can they do to help create a more stable environment for tech companies to operate in, especially given all these geopolitical tensions?
Governments need to step up and create clear, consistent regulations, a level playing field where everyone can compete fairly.
Right, no more of these protectionist policies that just end up hurting everyone in the long run.
Exactly. It's about fostering a global environment where innovation can flourish, not trying to stifle it. And governments also need to facilitate more dialogue, more cooperation between countries, find ways to resolve those disagreements peacefully, prevent things from escalating.
So a global rulebook for tech, something everyone can agree on, is that even possible?
It's a tall order, but it's worth striving for. There are already groups working on this, bringing together stakeholders from around the world to try and find some common ground.
That's encouraging. But let's talk about something we haven't really touched on yet, the ethical implications of AI. As this technology gets more powerful, shouldn't that be at the forefront of the conversation?
Absolutely. We can't just focus on who controls AI. We need to think about how it's being developed, how it's being used, making sure it benefits humanity, not just a select few.
So how do we do that? How do we bake ethics into the very core of AI development?
That's the challenge, isn't it? But there are organizations working on this right now, developing guidelines, promoting ethical AI, fostering global conversations about how to align these powerful technologies with our values.
That's good to hear. And while we're talking about big picture stuff, we have to talk about the supply chain, especially for semiconductors. This whole situation has really exposed how fragile that supply chain can be, right?
Absolutely. Relying so heavily on one region for such a crucial component, that's a vulnerability, especially when geopolitical tensions are running high. There's a growing movement to diversify the supply chain, make it more resilient, less dependent on any one country.
So spreading out the risk, making sure all our eggs aren't in one basket. But ultimately, doesn't this all come down to corporate responsibility? Tech companies taking the lead in building a more ethical, sustainable tech ecosystem.
They definitely have a role to play. Transparency, engagement with regulators, putting ethics alongside profits, but they can't do it alone. We need governments, international organizations, individuals, all working together.
So it's a collective effort. We all have a part to play.
Exactly. And individuals have more power than they think. We can educate ourselves, follow the news, have these conversations, be mindful consumers. Our choices matter.
So being informed, being engaged, and using our voices and our wallets to support the kind of tech future we want to see.
That's the idea.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from the specifics of Nvidia's situation to the broader implications for the entire tech industry. It's complex, it's evolving, and it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on.
I agree. This story is far from over.
But one thing's for sure, the choices we make today will shape the future of technology, and that future is in all of our hands. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our future episodes. We'll be back with more deep dives into the stories shaping our world.